Our scripture reading this morning comes from Acts 9, picking up in verse 36. It's one of my favorites, but it reads, "Now in Joppa there was a disciple whose name was Tabitha, which in Greek is Dorcas. She was devoted to good works and acts of charity. At the time she became ill and died. When they had washed her, they laid her in the room upstairs. Now since Lydda was near Joppa, the disciples, who heard that Peter was there, sent 2 men to him with a request, 'Please come to us without delay.' So Peter got up and went with them. And when he arrived, they took him to the room upstairs. All the widows stood beside him, weeping and showing tunics and other clothing that Dorcas had made while she was with them. Peter put all them outside. Then he knelt down and prayed. He turned to the body and said, 'Tabitha, get up.' Then she opened her eyes, and seeing Peter, she sat up. He gave her his hand and helped her up. Then calling the saints and widows, he showed her to be alive. This became known throughout Joppa, and many believed in the Lord. Meanwhile, he stayed in Joppa for some time with a certain Simon, a tanner." Friends, may God add a blessing to the hearing, to the reading, and the living of this word. Now, we are in a teaching series or a sermon series these couple weeks that we've called Wrestling with Doubt and Finding Faith. And that there's any number of great questions that keep people from finding faith in this life. Last week we talked about, well, what does it mean that to say, what do Christians really think about people of other religions? Do we just damn them kind of all to hell, or does God have sufficient enough grace, as we said last week, for all of God's children to be reconciled for Him, even if we don't completely understand all of it? And today, I want to hit on a point or a question that keep many skeptics from coming to faith or coming to be Christians, and that is this, right? That most Christians that we hear from folks outside the church, and they'll be quick to say, well, most Christians are hypocrites. And most Christians, though I may appreciate this man Jesus, or know a little bit about him, or maybe even had some experience in the church or one time or another, but my experience is done that I've been to church, I've tried that, and I've never really found anybody or groups of folks who were a lot like the person you say that you follow. You're hypocrites. To that, I just want to start up front this morning with, they're 100% right. They are 100% right. The church has been hypocritical on any number of topics, starting with the great chasm that exists between the church and Jesus. When I was early on in my pastoring relationship, I was going into my first church. I was nervous about everything that would be expected of me as a pastor and things that I would have to do. And, do you really have to be holier than everybody else or better behaved? And I'm like, well, that's not really me. So I really wasn't quite sure how to handle myself when my district superintendent at the time, the woman taking me in this church, she said, "Hey, don't worry about it. Don't stress it. They're going to go in there. They're going to demand a lot of you. They want Jesus. But you know how that would go when he got there." As if to indicate the fact that even if Jesus himself had come to that church, that they wouldn't like it very much. Which gets at our point that there is this very large gap between who Jesus was and is in this world and who the church is and was, or who we want to be even in this world. There's a large chasm that exists, and there's any number of examples that we can use. Most notably, slavery in the United States. And that even our beloved Methodist church then split into AME North and AME South, where we had good, faithful Christians believing that it was their own divine right to own another human being, and used our biblical passage to justify such a thing. We've had churches, and in the name of religion, Christians have persecuted people all over this world. And when early Christians, back certainly in this day, when we read all the way up into Acts chapter 9, were being persecuted. It's not too long till Christians get power, and they begin using that power against others. That instead of being wounded healers like Jesus, we tend to be those in power who inflict wounds on other people. We created systems. We kept people out. We created unnecessary rules that we became gatekeepers instead of students or disciples like this woman named Tabitha. There is a huge chasm between Jesus and the church. And so when folks do tell me, well, Don, churches and religious folks are just hypocritical at the end of the day, the honest answer is, we are. We absolutely are. But it's also something we ask for forgiveness for every Sunday in this place, and hopefully you're doing that at home, every place. But I personally, right, and I can't speak for anybody else, so I want to speak for myself here, find a lot of hope in texts like this one. In that, it says, now in Joppa, there was a disciple. Now, quick before I go on in that, quick side note, disciple, the Greek here is mathetria, which is interesting, because mathetes, which would be the common noun or proper noun for disciple, mathetria is the only time the Greek comes up in this word as if to indicate a female disciple. One more thing the church has been hypocritical on is whether or not women should be allowed to preach in our churches and teach in our churches, when in fact, Tabitha, here in the early church, was an early preacher. And not to mention the fact that Lydda, near Joppa, was probably the further edge of where evangelism was occurring for this early Christian movement. And where do we find on the edge, the cutting edge, spreading the gospel of Jesus Christ? We find a woman, of all places, while Peter and the rest of them are back in Jerusalem, back where the movement had gotten its start. But here, out on the outskirts of where the Christian movement at that time was beginning, you find Tabitha doing the hard work of being Christians in a place that probably had a number of skeptics about why she was there to begin with. And so we use Tabitha, and I see Tabitha as this object lesson, this example for what Christianity, what I think of pure Christianity, looks like. Tabitha, on the far reaches, was there, and we get indications from this text a little bit about how much people cared about her and that they prepared for her burial even after she died. And then when Peter comes up last minute to heal her, we get an indication of what her ministry was. All the widows stood beside him, weeping and showing tunics and other clothing that Dorcas had made while she was still with them. This woman had taken on widows, and as we know, widows in those early days in the ancient Near East were seen as way far less than, on the outskirts of society. If they didn't have a husband to care for their basic needs, they didn't have anybody. Legally, they had no status. But along comes this woman disciple to find the people that are hurting the most, who needed the basic necessities of life, and we find the woman disciple named Tabitha, there to offer clothing, perhaps to offer food, a home, and a loving relationship in that way. And it doesn't appear that Tabitha ever asked for anything in return. The church has been hypocritical, I'll admit. But when I find examples like Tabitha here, I wonder why we have highlighted other folks in our biblical narratives and texts, and I think we're a bit hypocritical as to why folks like Tabitha aren't as elevated to the level of someone like, well, say, St. Paul. Tabitha, who's out here, much like him, doing the hard work in this community, clothing people, housing people, doing what needs to be done in this kind of community, displays a certain level of, oh, well, this is what Jesus did in his life. Where her beliefs in Jesus Christ were now mirrored in her actions, where her beliefs came full form in Joppa with action. It's long been my dream. It's just one of those things that doesn't make your top to-do list. And that while we have folks in churches with any number of kinds of Bible studies and orders, I wish we had an order of St. Tabitha, of folks who were devoted to using their lives and their talents and their gifts and their resources for serving the least of these in our community. Because that's exactly what we see Jesus do in all four of our Gospels. While we can see many examples of this, within churches all over our country. I wonder if we wouldn't be better served off as a church, and we could answer the question better when folks say, well, aren't Christians just hypocritical? When our churches took seriously the call and the mission of Jesus Christ to live that out into the world. What would it look like if people selected churches that they went to, not necessarily based on worship styles or whether or not their children's ministry program was as good as the one next door? What if they were selecting churches based on things like, well, this church seemed to have organized itself around providing housing for people who doesn't have it. I've really been interested in something like that. Come on, family, let's go see what we can do. Or, this church, because I live here, really has a passion for seeking justice for the LGBTQ communities in our world and seeing that they have equal inclusion in all places in our community to make sure that there's a safe place that they can go. That's a passion of mine. God has called me to that work, and I would go to a church based on that aspect. What if I went to a church based on the fact that we sought justice for young brown and black people in our communities? Instead of, well, the pastor's pretty good there, or the worship style is so-and-so, because I think it goes like this. Too often in our churches, we've gotten to figure out that maybe if we just shove as much knowledge into the heads of our children and our parishioners, that eventually they'll understand and be able to live Christian lives. Well, the truth is, I think that discipleship happens, like Tabitha shows us, that true discipleship happens as we do it. As we try, as we do together, we learn and bump into one another, make suggestions, and eventually, in seeking a common goal for the betterment of the folks that have been left out in our societies, we tend to learn a lot. We tend to ask good questions. We tend to have better prayers. We tend to have better hearts because we have a better understanding of our neighbors and those we seek to be in mission with in this world, including Jesus Christ Himself. We learn more when we do. A lot of times I think we're just afraid to do and fail. Oh, we tried that and it didn't work. We tried that, we didn't show up. We tried that one thing. You know how often down here, and we've been pushing an effort in our downtown community to build affordable housing, to make sure that our families and children in our community have safe and affordable places to live, and that people have fresh and healthy food to eat, that we have safe streets to walk on, access to educational opportunities, and make sure that health care is available to every resident of this city. And in so doing, we do something that I like to call community organizing. And community organizing is just this, organizing folks around given causes and those kinds of things. But the truth is, even though you might have so many people within a community, every time you hold an event, whether it's a barbecue or something, we got a tenant union meeting coming up here on May and 19th, and where we're trying to organize folks who have been subject to poor living conditions as a result of slumlords taking advantage of them. We're trying to organize them, get people together, realize that they have power in their voices when they come together, and that we can stand up against the powers of money, and these landlords have been taking advantage of people for a really long time. But when we hold these events, truthfully, we know there's a lot of those folks out there. But you usually only get 20, 25 people. But let me tell you something. Those 20, 25 that show up to have dinner and have a conversation about what they can do to help their neighbors, I would live and fight and die for those 25. Tabitha goes into this community right here to offer clothing and the love of Jesus Christ with what she had to offer in that time. And on her death, we see the fruits of her labors in the tears of those widows that she helped and them holding up their tunics as if to show Peter, look what she did for us. The question I always think about churches is, and as we've seen church numbers and attendance decline across, specifically the United States, here and churches close and church buildings shutter up, and some people grieve that. But I often wonder, if your church closed, who would miss it? Who would miss it? And sadly, probably that answer for many of those churches is probably the people that would miss it were just those few folks that hung on in the end. But the thousands of people living outside that church, either in positions of squalor, people who feel like the church overlooked them for a long time, those LGBTQ folks who weren't allowed in to begin with, and for many years, the people who felt left out of that space probably aren't going to miss it. I don't know how many widows that they would have show up and show the tunics and their hearts and their tears as a result of it being closed. That's why I say when folks look at you and say, well, Christians are just hypocritical. Well, yeah, guilty as charged. But with the help of examples like Tabitha, and when I come into this place, and when I bring my family into this place, and I see the man Jesus Christ in our rose window there, and we sing the songs and in worship, and I feel empowered to recognize the chasm not only between me, but between our church and Jesus Christ, I feel empowered to do something about it. Because it not only brings life to me, but I've seen the power and the life that it can bring to the community outside of these walls. People who show up here who have no idea about the poverty right outside of this church, who come in here and ask me good questions after church. Well, Don, I didn't know that. What can I do to help? And in so doing, you might have asked, it's like you just asked me who Jesus was to begin with, because I believe that better than me describing it would be me taking you and showing you. Make a tunic. And then we work together and we get out there and we do and we work and we serve together. We learn more about each other and we know more about this man Jesus, and we tend to grow in love over the course of our lives. And we can look back at those times where we tried and we failed and we only got 15 people, but those were a great 15 people. And remember that one person who came to that one meeting and he ended up getting tagged on. He ended up being in our children's programming for the next summer, and he did that great thing and impacted that kid. And it's a whole movement of the Holy Spirit after that. It just didn't require a whole bunch of classes for us to sit here and tell you how to do it. It's a whole lot easier for a church to show people who Jesus is through their action than just talking them to death. The fullest expression of what we believe about the man Jesus comes out in how we love our neighbors. Tabitha's fullest expression about who she thought Jesus was came out in the forms of those shirts and those tunics. Comes out in our churches and those parish nurses who have taken care of people for so many decades, not just within their churches, on outside of their churches. So many times when our kids program goes out into these neighborhoods where nobody shows up and simply walks up to the child's door and says, hey, would you like to come play this afternoon? So many times when we get, friends, we are in contract on 10 homes in our neighborhood that we are hoping to get fixed up as an expression of our love for our community that flows from Jesus Christ himself. So I get it. The church is hypocritical, but I need this place to close that gap just a little bit. I don't know if I'll ever get there. I don't think we'll ever get to close that gap to where it looks like this, and there'll be plenty of naysayers on the way. But I need this place. I need a church. I need a community, and I need you in person to come together and realize that we need each other to grow in love and holiness together and get out there and do the work. Figure it out together and grow in love. And that the fullest expression of what we believe as followers of Jesus Christ comes out in our love for neighbors, just like Tabitha here. Like the love of a good mother, of a good father. Expressed in real and tangible ways. Friends, I don't know about you. The answer is yes. Christians are hypocritical. But we're trying not to be, with God's help. Amen. And let's try it again.